Thanks for joining us for another episode of Lead.exe. I'm Brian Comerford.
And I'm Nick Lozano.
Today we're joined by our guest, Tommy Reed, who's going to be speaking with us a little bit on the topic of organizational development, a topic that I know is near and dear to his heart. Tommy, maybe you can kick us off with a little bit of a backgrounder on yourself and what led you to the path of being an OD practitioner as well as a technologist.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to thank you both for the opportunity. I'm glad to be a part of this with you. So my background is, I've been in IT most of my adult life, actually probably all of my adult life, in various capacities. I've been at my current organization for about 16 years and pretty much been in all capacities of technology, except probably development. So that's everything from just being on the ground, helping folks with their day-to-day, all the way through leadership of the IT organization, infrastructure. I'm now in cybersecurity, and which is really where my passion is. I'm very happy to be there of late. My educational background is my bachelor's is in management from Baker University here in Kansas, and my master's is in organization development. Which is, aside from technology, probably one of my true passions at least in the leadership realm of things.
Well, and that's part of what intrigues me about you as a technology leader. Most technologists don't rattle off that kind of an academic background. So I'm kind of curious, how did those two paths end up running concurrently for you in your professional life?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really started with my desire to just sort of round things out. I've always loved technology. I've always been, even a troubleshooter at heart, very analytical, problem solving, that sort of thing. But one of the things that I noticed in my career, even early on, was just how sort of black and white we tend to be as technologists, in terms of maybe we, and not to knock the practice, because I can't knock the field that's near and dear to my heart, but we may tend to throw technical solutions to a challenge. For example, if only we had this tool, if only we had this software, because that's what technology does for us, right? It's letting robots do the thing that frees us up as humans to do the thinking, while the computers do the doing, and so. So that's all great, but at least in my experience, I wanted to have more of a knowledge and background around how human behavior contributes to who we are as an organization. And, you apply this to anything, whether it's technology or any industry. OD. There's a lot of definitions out there around what OD is. My favorite that I kind of lean on lately is, organizations, they're made up of people. People have behaviors, and those behaviors impact the organization. And so, I originally set out to apply that to how I could perform better on a team, how I could lead better on a technology team. And now my interest has sort of grown beyond that to just, the entire company culture, within my own organization, as well as helping out others. So I don't know, human behavior is just, it's fascinating to me and how that, again, impacts and influences culture and organizations.
So while you may not consider yourself a developer, it sounds like you are a bit of a designer as well.
A wee bit.
A lot of what you just described there, I would qualify as characteristics of what back in the day used to be called human-centered design. Now we tend to call it experience design, but very much, it's those human behavior principles. How does that drive us to interact with technology? And certainly on the technology-facing side of an interface, how people work with the tech is a critical component from, being able to scope project implementations, rollout, training, all those types of things, as well as the actual system design itself. So taking that sort of mindset and applying it to how do you actually structure the development of a department, particularly one that you may have inherited. I'd be curious to get some of your insight on that. Kind of starting with, how do you find the key skill set that's already intrinsic to your team? Mm-hmm. And then how do you take something and kind of shake out the box and start from the beginning with an OD practitioner's mindset?
Yeah, I love that question. So I think at its base, a common mistake that we could tend to make when we design a team is, finding the right resource to perform a technical task that's based on, the skill set that you see on the resume. And those are important things. I think, when I look at all of that through the mindset of organization development, one of the axioms of OD is that, and this is not a new concept. We've all heard that leadership is an activity, not a position. And so, because of that, leadership is, something that you want to see at all levels of the organization, not just at the top, part of the hierarchy triangle there. And so, keeping that in mind, if leadership, if you want to see that at all levels of the organization, at least in my mind, I want to see, when I'm designing a team, some of those competencies in a teammate that's not just, do you know how to code on this platform, or do you know how to break fix, this particular technology or application? And that, that's not easy. That doesn't always come out in process. A lot of times you may not completely understand how a particular contributor may fit into your organizational culture until they've been there a year or two. Because again, culture is, it's not as measurable as what what we traditionally can measure, or people that are into finance, we like numbers, we like spreadsheets, we can measure it. There's the number. Culture, how do you measure that? And it's not that you can't, but it's a little more squishy, I guess. So that's, I guess, the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to designing a team is just thinking, I want folks who are not just, know this widget or know this technology, but they're on board and can help transform the organization to where we desire our culture to be, if we're in the middle of a culture change, I guess.
That's great. So tell me a little bit, I love that you brought up the axiom that leadership is an activity, not a title, not a role. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about some methods that you've applied to help elevate some of the team members that you've had, really to take them from that place of a contributor mindset into more of a strategic leadership type of thinking.
Yeah, sort of the most basic, and it's not, really, I don't think terribly eye-opening or transformative. It's just be a little fearless. I have always coached anyone who has come to me and said, well, that's not really my place. And I didn't feel like I should speak up in that meeting, or didn't want to step on anybody's toes. I mean, we've all heard this, right? I've always just coached, step on toes, be fearless, be, not aggressive, don't be a jerk or anything, but I don't know if folks just have a natural fear that their position or authority will be challenged as a leader if any of their contributors sort of speak up. But I know, when I've had a large amount of direct reports, I craved that as a leader. And so I always try to encourage folks to really step outside of their comfort zone. That's sort of what my background and experience is just, I didn't fear just sort of respectfully speaking up and either challenging assumptions or just really, taking ownership of things that may have been outside of my skill set that I could just then grow into. I think it's easy to sort of, fall back on I can do these things because this is within my skill set. Just don't be afraid to step out of things, even if you have no idea how to do it. I've heard that consistently from most leaders that anytime that they grew in their experience was because they just challenged themselves to grow into something. I've heard CEOs tell me this, and it just, lean into it.
No, Tommy, it seems like to me, when I hear you speaking, there's almost like a dichotomy to it, right? You don't want to, surround yourself with yes men. You're kind of looking for people who have ideas and will kind of challenge you. Not that they want confrontation, but, to bring out maybe that there's a mistake that somebody's making down the road to kind of, have enough confidence to do that. And it seems like you also enable your team to fail at something, which is what I feel like a lot of people are kind of afraid to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Having permission to fail at all levels, at the I keep saying leadership level, but that's at the top of the hierarchy. I'll put it that way. All the way to any member of the cross section of the organization having permission to fail. And I think sometimes if we're lower on that food chain, giving folks that we report to permission to fail and some of that forgiveness. And if we can have that sort of back and forth where and it's not the goal, it's not what we're going for, right? But if you're taking risks and if you're putting yourself out there and going, outside of what your quote unquote skill set is, then yeah, you're gonna fail. But that's also where you're gonna learn. And so I think if you're so restrictive to where and so perfectionist where you don't have the freedom to fail, I would probably find something else to do, and to just really assess, what are my values? How am I going to learn if I don't have that liberty?
There's a technique in neuro-linguistic programming, and I think this might even be something that I've heard Tony Robbins use before, where if you run into a situation where you don't know what to do, which invariably all of us will, right? Part of how you can adapt that mindset very quickly is to say, okay, I don't know how to do this, but if I did know how to do it, what would I do? And then all of a sudden, there's that shift in your thinking that enables you to step forward and actually see the challenge from more of a solution-oriented mindset versus being locked up with the uncertainty, of what kind of decision to make. I know that that's something that has been a technique that I've shared with some of my direct reports over the years, particularly as they run into, some of those key challenges. Are there some other techniques that you can think of that are similar, that you think have been beneficial to those that you've helped to coach or who have reported up to you?
Yeah, I think so. I guess another area where I'm a little passionate about is just sort of knowledge of self. And so again, that's going back to the behavioral component of OD, where our organizations or whatever culture or whatever, we're part of. We're made up of people. People have behaviors, and those then impact that particular environment. And so, knowledge of self is, I guess, important to me, because some of those, as you were mentioning, if we tend to sort of doubt ourselves, the reason we doubt ourselves is probably somewhere in that we'll probably discover when we know ourselves. And that could be part of any, whether it's a personality profile or any of the, dozens of models out there to learn more about ourselves. It's going to, show up there, I think. So is it because I'm afraid of, I've had a bad experience in the past, or maybe I had my hand slapped for trying and failing, or is it just because I'm just more comfortable doing exactly what I know how to do? And that's fine too. I mean, we need technical experts that, that they're great at what they do and don't necessarily want to, I guess, branch out. And, their focus is more on being really competent about certain things and put the book learning and the class learning in front of that. That's fine. Some of us may be a little more fearless and put ourselves out there. And I think when you know yourself, I guess can really decide how you want to approach leadership and approach your role on a team.
That's one question for you. We kind of brought up behavioral science. So are we taking, or would you think that, a leader should take their team and kind of have them do like DISC profiles, or what's the other one, like Big Five, or one of those other type of personality tests, or is there something else, leaders should be thinking about?
No, I think those are great. DISC, MBTI, process communication model. They all overlap. At least everyone that I've encountered or had any experience with. I think those are great. They can help one as a leader of a team understand what your own constraints are and what your own opportunities are. The one thing that I find consistent with all of them is they almost immediately expose to yourself and to your team members, oh, so that's why we rub each other the wrong way, or that's why we had this conflict last Thursday. And then, going beyond that, it's how I can either change, my assumptions that I'm bringing to a conversation or a situation. And then hopefully, when everyone's engaged in doing that together, a team can move out of, if they're in a storming phase, they can move more into a norming and performing type phase, that sort of thing. But the one thing that I would ask leaders to sort of put more onus on themselves is, and you'll see this in PCM is, take a little more responsibility to modifying your language to fit the person that you're speaking with. So if they're more of a dreamer and sort of out there and sort of bouncing from concept to concept and not just, the workaholic that's just drilled down on technical work, sort of speak their language and to the workaholic, you may value more like, when is this getting done? When is the deadline? That sort of thing, that engage your audience, I guess. And that looks different depending on what model you're working from. But, short answer, yes, I think those are very valuable to inform a leader on his or her team.
So some of what I'm hearing you say is that it's critical not only that you go through that type of assessment, but then that the results of that assessment are openly shared with all members of the team.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, share it and keep it current. I've heard anecdotes of, like MBTI INTJ, for example. So I might put INTJ next to my nameplate on the wall outside my office, or I've heard companies that do that. They'll post these things outside of their offices, and so that when you step into a conversation with someone, me being the introvert, I don't want to, I don't want to talk as much as most anyone else, but or my energy comes from a different place than the extrovert might. So I don't know. I think when you do those sort of things, you can have a little fun with it. You can learn from each other. You can crack jokes about it, but yeah, definitely make it public and make it a shared learning experience.
I've got a question for you around, how to hire. And really, my question is, as a leader, do you hire first based on skill set or first based on culture fit?
Ooh, that's a good one. I value both, of course. But skill set is really easy to get to the bottom of. It comes out in the resume, and it comes out usually in the first part of any conversation, right? So, if you say that you're, speaking to the sort of the technology field, if you say that you're a Microsoft certified systems engineer, through a handful of conversations, I'm going to learn pretty quickly whether that's an embellishment on the resume or if you truly are an MCSE. Culture fit, I think I probably spend a little more time on some of those things, as challenging as it may be, because, I don't want to bring someone on board that's going to disrupt the team negatively. I mean, disruption in itself isn't necessarily negative, but but have a negative long-term adverse effect. Certainly there may be a storming phase as there is typically when any team goes through any kind of change, and that can be, just changing one position within that team. You go all the way back through forming, storming, and all that. But it's important enough to me to where, I'm going to ask questions. Some of the it may be an SBR. Give me a situation, your behavior, and the result of that. That's more in an adaptive challenge situation than necessarily how you fixed a certain server or put out a piece of software. What were some of the more adaptive components of that particular project where you added then value?
That's great. I'm curious too about, do you have a similar line of questioning around conflict resolution, how someone might approach being challenged with difficult situations?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, pretty much take them back through the SBR model of, give me examples of what that situation, behavior, and result was. I don't think I've ever interviewed anyone for a technology position that didn't have some sort of conflict example. And in technology, that ranges, everywhere from, frustrated with my PC, and it's a help desk technician that we're interviewing for, how they handle sort of the frustrated person. Nobody calls the help desk or calls 911 when things are going great, right? So I want to hear how they, sort of keep the heat at the appropriate level, or at least manage their own emotions when the person on the other end of the phone isn't being reasonable, and that's certainly the case too. All the way through, some of your more complex scenarios where, it's a large scale project where there's competing values and conflicting, desires within an organization. You may have, some heavyweights in the organization that don't even agree with the particular project or the initiative, and that's certainly a challenge, and not for the timid.
I do have a question for you. Now, it seems like this organizational development is kind of a top-down initiative. Let's say you want to deploy it within your department or your silo, and you don't have top management from. Is there a way you can kind of do this from bottom up instead of just doing top down, that you can get buy-in more to show upper management that maybe it should be something taken seriously and maybe taken organizational wide, kind of a way to pilot, organizational development?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think to have an official sort of OD intervention or project, it's absolutely likely going to be a top down, or whether we've either hired an on-site OD practitioner, or we've challenged a team to put together an OD practice or intervention, or we've gone outside, which is probably more often the case, going outside to a consultant who's competent in OD. Lacking that, and that's not to say that OD in and of itself is a top-down philosophy, because OD is actually in and of itself, it's the opposite of that. It's a very democratic process. But onboarding it with a company is often top-down, and you do have to have that top-down support. So it's being a democratic philosophy where one key concept is that the shared corporate knowledge exists at all levels of the company. So one approach is to just begin practicing. It goes a little bit back to what I mentioned earlier on in the call of it just being a little bit fearless, learning. Maybe it's suggesting a small project around emotional intelligence, or coming to your supervisor and saying, hey, I realize we kind of struggle. We may have these things going great, but I kind of wonder if some of our personal conflict could be resolved if we looked at this personality profile, or doing some of that softer stuff, and just sort of nudging a little bit. And that's actually a little bit of how I started, even before I studied OD, was just looking outside of what our day-to-day tasks were, and just, and I guess again, this comes from being a sort of a troubleshooter at heart, was finding, maybe problems that existed on our team, or opportunities to sort of think outside of this project, or fixing this system, or installing this software, or whatever, and just learning how we as a team can develop. So I guess short answer is nudge, it's sort of behind, and then and hopefully, if you do your homework and consult a little bit, and have a successful outcome, you can kind of push that a little bit further and say, well, there's actually a little bit of method to my madness, and we might seriously consider what some of our opportunities might be if we did go and budget for next year some OD practitioner knowledge, or maybe develop the skill set of a certain team member, which happened to be my experience. So yeah, I think there's a few opportunities there to do that without the top-down support.
That's great. I've got a follow-up question on that, and this is really around kind of assessing what you've got, right? So I'm curious, talk a little bit about your approach or your leadership style that might help inform assessing what it is that you might need on a team that you currently don't have, as well as filtering out some of those things that aren't working.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that actually touches on another just key competency and philosophy around OD, and that's around assessment and research. It's very much a practice where we do a lot more listening than we do telling and directing and prodding and that sort of thing. So, for example, putting it in the context of culture, for example, say you have an OD initiative, or a corporate initiative around our corporate culture. One of the first things you want to do is just assess where you're at, and how much gap is there between where you're at and where you're going, and the sky's the limit. I know we don't have time to get into all of the particular possibilities there, because there is no one culture that's right. So for example, Apple wants to change the world, and another technology company want to make just huge margin on software that solves a particular problem. Well, the latter is easy to disrupt, because you just make better software, make a better widget. But neither one of those cultures are necessarily wrong. So you start with, in this example of culture, is just assessing. And, there's a variety of methods to assess. I particularly like just sort of breaking things down to where you are today and where you desire to be. Where are you currently, and what are your aspirations, and seeing what those gaps are. And, there's just a variety of reasons why you may be off the mark. And that could vary by the age of the company. The further you get from the founding of an organization where a culture is strong and well known, and probably even very public. Think of some of the Silicon Valley companies where they're young, new, and fresh, and so the culture is very much well known. Well, once you start getting multiple decades and generations between that startup phase into a mature phase, that can evolve radically. Sometimes for the negative and sometimes for the better. So, long answer, longer. A lot of research, a lot of assessing, a lot of diagnosis. One thing that I've experienced in the OD field with those who have done a lot of practicing outside of their own organization is, a lot of times, when an organization comes to a practitioner to say, help us out here, through that process of inquiry and diagnosis, you may find that what they're asking for may be completely unrelated to what they really need. And so, and that's why diagnosis is so important. Help us roll out this project to install this piece of software, because we're getting a lot of resistance and we need to overcome that resistance. Okay. Well, that resistance contains information, right? And so through that diagnostic phase, you may learn that, maybe the person raising their hand and reaching out to the OD practitioner, they're either wrong or they're misinformed, or, they're looking at it through a particular lens that either doesn't benefit the organization or doesn't benefit it as well as it could. And so again, it's in diagnostics that this type of information presents itself. And ultimately, the OD practitioner is not there to sort of tell you what to do, but more to give you the competency as an organization to solve this for yourself.
Very good stuff. We were kind of talking earlier offline before we started the show, and I kind of see lots of resemblance between Lean Six Sigma and OD. And I feel like that's kind of a good jumping point for some leaders to kind of get into this, because a lot of this seems very familiar to me. Is there a way you can kind of take some of those concepts and apply them to OD to kind of get your feet wet to dip into the content?
Yeah, that's a little bit in the the quality management and process side, and there's certainly a lot of intersection there. It's one area where I am not an expert or have a lot of practice in. Again, OD it's got multiple facets, including consulting and leadership coaching, diagnosing and assessing culture, large group facilitation, and the quality management and change management piece. So Lean Six Sigma, for example, I can't speak a whole lot to that whatsoever, but it's definitely a facet and a component that may present itself as a solution for an organization if they're struggling in that area.
So on that note, are there other designations that one can pursue beyond going for a full-blown master's program in OD? What are some sort of bite-sized variations of, as Nick said, getting your feet wet and having an understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some credentials around coaching that is very much it can be an end result after, say, going for a full-blown master's or a stair step up into. That would probably be the one that mostly comes to mind. There's some various consulting accreditations. Others, project management is might be a cousin, but not necessarily a core competency within OD. But one of the reasons why I bring it up is because I feel like sometimes project managers are often saddled with some of these adaptive challenges in, rolling out a particular initiative. We all look to the project manager. Well, how do we resolve this conflict? Well, it's not his or her responsibility. So I bring that up more to say project managers might be interested in looking at some OD concepts to help sort of herd the cats that come about in some of these, especially technology projects, as I know that both of you are very familiar with. There's just it seems more often than not there's more adaptive challenges that present themselves than just the technical quick fixes.
Well, as a certified Scrum Master, I resemble that remark. I definitely feel like I've been put into the OD light practitioner role on more than one occasion, for sure.
I've seen it.
But on that note, I'd like to talk a little bit about leadership styles. I've heard you reference multiple times now the term adaptive. Knowing you, I know that's something that's already, an area of passion for you. How does that, factor into having sort of that review and assess mindset? More of that agile approach or situational sort of leadership style. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So I think on the positive front, there's no shortage. I guess it's positive. There's no shortage of adaptive challenges in any organization, and so we I've seen time and time again, and I know the two of you have as well, where a technical problem is treated as an adaptive challenge is treated as a technical problem, right? And so, and just to sort of define for the listeners, your technical problems are those things that they're easy to identify. They're often solved by a technical expert. You can outsource it. You can just, we just need somebody to come in here, write this code, do this thing, install this software, and the solution is very easy to identify. The reason I bring it up, and I encounter it just about constantly anymore, is that adaptive challenges are often misidentified as technical problems. The adaptive being, they're not as easy to define, and to solve them, it may require more than one individual. It may require us to change our thinking. It may challenge our culture, sort of on the more difficult scale. The people that are responsible for solving it could likely be the people that are responsible for causing it. And so, that's not, you don't get that in a Microsoft book or a Cisco book on how to do technology, right? And so again, you've kind of touched on something that was an area of passion for me, and part of why I sort of, set out to study organization development and sort of this sort of subset of technical and adaptive is that I felt personally just ill-equipped to deal with adaptive challenges, especially if I was using an old framework of, I'm not the leader, I'm not the boss, I'm not at this particular slot or box on the hierarchy. Who am I to say that this director and this C-level person, need to get in the room and duke this out before, they start buying technology. So it is one area where I would recommend any technologist who's struggling with sort of, I can't fix this with a widget, or I can't fix this with this particular initiative, to really look into adaptive and technical. And it's just very eye-opening, I think.
Certainly an area where I've encountered it probably the most is when there's suddenly a rally cry to change some particular system because there's a perceived stigma against an existing system. And from a diagnostic perspective, I tend to come to that kind of thing. I ask a lot of questions, and of course, having more of a requirements gathering background from a software development side of technology, it's, you have to have a fundamental understanding of where those challenges are occurring. And once you've got a list put together, you suddenly realize, okay, out of these 12 things, 2 of them seem to be related to the technology. The rest of them are either lack of rules of engagement, no accountability, no management mandates, process deficiencies, lack of standardized processes, a lot of those things. So I really resonate with what you're talking about related to the adaptive technical challenges. It's easier for folks who are not well attuned to this way of thinking to immediately cite the technology as being at the center of the problem, when really there are a lot of these other things that factor into it. So I think that's a very valuable mindset and trait for any leader to be able to acknowledge and embrace, whether or not they're directly responsible for technology or not.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, because I think that's something that I would ask your listeners who are in more of that decision making, higher up the organizational chart, having that responsibility for some of these things, because a lot of times they just hear the feedback that, software X stinks and, we're just not using it. And so, they may come to a technologist and say, well, we got to get rid of software X and go to software Y because I'm hearing that it stinks. And so I guess where I would challenge leaders to do is to, just as you do, and we've all done historically, is maybe up front sort of ask some of those questions and do a little bit of that diagnosis up front to find out, okay, is it really just the software? and using the example that you gave, there's a lot of a lot of things may potentially present themselves to where they can either push back, or while they're engaging technology to sort of fix the problem, be a little more informed as to the non-technical aspects of it.
Tommy, I'd like to ask you another question related to, let's just do a little scenario role playing here. So say you're a new leader. You're either being promoted into a leadership role, you've been moved into an organization from another organization, and you're trying to get your feet on the ground. You're ultimately trying to go through that assessment process of, what is the existing department design that you've inherited. And by the way, you've also just been handed a directive from the top level manager that whatever it is that you accomplish, we're going to have, by God, technology strategy. So when you have those types of things that seem, like pretty insurmountable challenges to deal with in a new leadership role, where do you start? Do you put the strategy first? Do you start going through more of a department design analysis? Walk us through a little bit of how you solve that.
I was going to say yes to all of it. you do
the easy fix. Just say yeah.
Yeah, no, you do kind of have to walk and chew gum at the same time, because especially in technology, or when you're leading a technology practice within your company, nobody's going to wait or be patient. In my experience, I've gone from peer to manager, which has many challenges just at the outset. On top of the expectations of your peers, who, by the way, I tend to continue to think of everyone as peers, no matter where I am in the box of the organizational chart. We're all in this together. It sort of reminds me of Nick, what you shared in your opening podcast about the Navy SEALs. That leader that's in that boat is very much an active participant in getting past the breakers in the ocean, but also leading. So that never changes. But one of the new complexities that I guess is added to that scenario, Brian, that you mentioned, is the expectations of top management, because maybe you've been put here because there's new expectations, or we need new blood in here. We want this certain change to take place, whatever that may be. And then if you were blessed to be put in that position, but you now have that responsibility to either, build on an existing strategy, throw it all out, start a new one altogether, and do it simultaneously with some of those design needs that you may have on your team. So I guess, again, short answer is it needs to happen simultaneously. If you're new to an organization or have sort of risen through the ranks, I still think some of the competencies are the same. I think it starts with listening, a lot of listening, and that's listening to the various business partners within the organizational network, that whether they're sort of all things are good, just keep doing what you're doing, that's great, all the way down to, okay, we've sort of been neglected for years, and this is what I need from you. Pulling all of that information together and making sure that it's part of your overall strategy. And some of those are more internal focused things. So again, simultaneously, you're looking at what's the external focus with your organization. Are we looking to transform? Are we looking to disrupt? Are we looking to just keep going, but just increase our growth and profitability? Keep doing what sort of our hedgehog. You've got to know all that, and you've got to know all of it at the same time. I don't think you want to spend a lot of time gathering that information and then designing your team, a year or two later. Even though some of that may take that long, it really depends on sort of the state of what you've inherited.
Well, I'm glad you can make it sound so easy.
It ain't.
It's that easy button, right? You just pick it up at Staples, hit it, right? It's done.
Always takes me back to.
Go ahead.
Always takes me back to one of my favorite Bob Lewis books. Leading IT, still the toughest job in the world.
Yes. I recall that one. No, talking about it is easy, and I don't mean to make it sound easy, because it really isn't.
So since we're on the topic of books, Tommy, is there a book that you recommend other people to read, or that had a big influence on you, or that you gift, or any piece of media or anything like that?
Yeah. There's a few sort of on the OD front. One of my favorites that I break out now and again is the Corporate Culture Survival Guide by Edgar Schein. It's not terribly new. I think it was early 2000s. It's got just a lot of good nuggets in the area of culture, whether you're just wanting to understand the importance of culture with the makeup of an organization or the development of your organization. Even if you're starting up, I would recommend that. My favorite tome of all time on the topic of technical and adaptive is it's one that your listeners have likely heard of, is Leadership on the Line by Ronald, Heifetz, and Marty Linsky. I think it's a little bit older, probably early 2000s, 2001 or so, and it's constantly updated. I think there's several additions into it, but again, it's got a lot of great case studies on adaptive and technical, and just a good foundation on that whole front. And then lastly, I think from a personal development perspective, I'm a huge fan, and I break it open every now and again, is Seth Godin's Linchpin. And so it was particularly eye-opening for me as I was going through some of my adult education. I had the fortunate pleasure of going through my master's program while also having just recently been promoted into a new role. And things were awfully crazy when I picked up this book. And it was really helpful in terms of understanding where, how you can position yourself as someone, you're not just a cog in the machine that's easily replaceable. You're a linchpin, which is the analogy is it's, you pull the linchpin out and the machine falls apart. And so, organizations, and it has a message for the individual as well as the organization. So, the message to the individual is make yourself indispensable so that, you can grow within the organization. The message to the organization is hire and develop and bring on linchpins, because, then you as an organization become indispensable. So if you have cogs in your machine that can't be replaced, that you as a whether you're a disruptor or protecting yourself from disruption are now irreplaceable because of the just the quality of folks that you have on board.
Risky is safe. Safe is risky.
Yes.
It's one of my favorite Seth Godin quotes.
It's got to be, right. That's a classic right there.
Good stuff from Seth.
Well, Tommy, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to meet with us. This is a topic that we could take multiple hours really drilling down into the importance of it, and it's again something that spans all leadership practices, not just leadership within technology. So I find your insight very valuable and really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us and with our listeners as well.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me, and appreciate the chat.
Thanks. And if listeners want to reach out to you, is there any way they can get a hold of you or find you on the internet? I know you said you're kind of not on social media, but
No, I'm on the LinkedIn. So I can just be found by searching for Tommy Reed out on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you, Tommy, for taking the time out of your day to, be a guest here on Lead.exe. And I feel like you've provided a lot of valuable insights for our listeners to kind of take back and soak it all in. And we'll probably have to have you back on to explore more of this organizational development, as I feel like we've just kind of, barely scratched the surface. We haven't even really got anywhere, I feel like.
Yeah, I think we really did. We just kind of hit it at the top level, and it'd be a pleasure to join you sometime.
That's great. Thanks again, Tommy.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you both.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Tommy Reed. Just a couple quick closing items. If you could go ahead and leave us a review or subscribe if you liked any of our content, either on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. And if you have any questions, concerns, comments, or feedbacks, if you could just go ahead and shoot us an email, info@leadexe.com. And also, I just want to let the audience know that we do post full transcripts of the show on our website. That's www.leadexe.com. Thank you.